Let's set the scene. It's February 1943, and inside a sprawling Westinghouse Electric factory in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, workers are streaming past the bulletin board during their morning shift change. Among the usual notices about production quotas and safety reminders hangs a brand new poster. It's simple, bold, and impossible to ignore. A woman in a red polka-dotted bandana and denim work shirt stares directly at you, her right arm flexed to show a muscular bicep, her face radiating confidence and determination. Above her head, in white letters against a bright yellow background, are four words that would eventually echo through generations. We can do it. The workers glanced at it, nodded approvingly, and moved on to their welding stations and assembly lines. Within 2 weeks, the poster disappeared, taken down and forgotten, just another piece of corporate propaganda that served its immediate purpose and then vanished into the archives. That should have been the end of the story. A poster commissioned by Westinghouse's War Production Coordinating Committee, designed by Pittsburgh artist J. Howard Miller, displayed for exactly 2 weeks in February 1943, then filed away and forgotten for nearly 4 decades. But here's where history gets interesting. That forgotten poster would eventually become the most recognizable symbol of female empowerment in American history. Today, the image of that woman with her rolled-up sleeve and flexed bicep appears on everything from postage stamps to coffee mugs, from museum exhibits to protest signs. She's been reproduced millions of times, referenced in countless books, films, and television shows, and adopted as an icon by movements from feminism to labor rights. That woman became known to the world as Rosie the Riveter, though the real story behind that name is far more complex and fascinating than most people realize. So here's the central question we're going to explore. What made this one poster, among thousands of propaganda images produced during World War II, transform into such an enduring and iconic symbol? Why does Rosie the Riveter still matter more than 8 decades after she first appeared? And most importantly, what does her story tell us about a pivotal moment in American history when women fundamentally changed not just the outcome of a global war, but the very fabric of American society itself? To understand how Rosie became immortal, we need to rewind to a moment of absolute crisis in American history. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. The date that President Franklin D. Roosevelt said would live in infamy. In a single morning, Japanese forces devastated the Pacific Fleet, killing more than 2,400 Americans and plunging the United States into the largest conflict the world had ever seen. Within days, America declared war not just on Japan, but on Germany and Italy as well, committing the nation to a two-front war that would require a mobilization of resources, industry, and human power on a scale never before attempted. The challenge was staggering. American military planners estimated they would need to send 16 million men into uniform, draining the nation's factories, shipyards, and farms of their male workforce at the exact moment when production demands were about to explode. The United States had to become, in Roosevelt's famous phrase, the arsenal of democracy, supplying not just American forces, but also allies in Britain, the Soviet Union, and China with weapons, vehicles, ships, and aircraft. Meeting these production targets with the traditional male workforce was mathematically impossible. The solution seemed obvious, but was culturally revolutionary: recruit women into industrial work on a massive scale. In 1940, before the war, women made up about 24% of the American workforce, and most of those women worked in traditionally feminine roles like teaching, nursing, domestic service, or light manufacturing jobs in textile mills. The idea of women working with heavy machinery, wielding welding torches, driving rivets into aircraft fuselages, or climbing inside ship hulls was not just unusual, it was considered by many to be inappropriate, even dangerous. American society in the early 1940s operated under strictly defined gender roles that had persisted for generations. A woman's place, as the popular wisdom went, was in the home, managing the household, raising children, and supporting her husband's career. Working women were often viewed with suspicion or pity, assumed to be unmarried, widowed, or married to men who couldn't provide adequately for their families. The very idea that married women with children might work outside the home was considered by many to be a form of maternal neglect. But war creates its own imperatives, and desperate times demanded desperate measures. The U.S. government, working with industry leaders, launched one of the most ambitious propaganda campaigns in American history, designed specifically to recruit women into war work and to change public attitudes about female industrial workers. The War Manpower Commission, the Office of War Information, and private companies coordinated efforts to create posters, radio advertisements, newsreel features, and magazine articles celebrating the woman war worker. This is where Rosie the Riveter was born, not as a single person or even a single image, but as a multimedia propaganda phenomenon designed to fundamentally reshape American society. The name Rosie the Riveter actually appeared before Miller's famous poster. In 1942, songwriters Red Evans and John Jacob Loeb composed a patriotic tune called Rosie the Riveter, which became a nationwide hit. The song told the story of a fictional woman named Rosie who worked all day protecting her boyfriend Charlie, who was far, far away in the military. The song painted Rosie as patriotic, hardworking, and feminine, reassuring listeners that war work didn't make women unfeminine or threatening to traditional values. This song created the cultural foundation that Miller's poster would later build upon. In May 1943, just a few months after Miller's poster appeared and disappeared, another iconic image emerged. Norman Rockwell, America's most beloved illustrator, painted his own version of Rosie the Riveter for the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. Rockwell's Rosie was muscular, confident, and decidedly working class, shown taking her lunch break with a rivet gun across her lap and a copy of Mein Kampf crushed under her feet. This image was instantly recognizable and widely distributed, appearing in millions of homes across America. Here's the fascinating twist. For decades, when Americans thought of Rosie the Riveter, they were actually thinking of Rockwell's painting, not Miller's "We Can Do It" poster. Miller's poster had been so limited in its original distribution, seen only by Westinghouse employees for 2 weeks in 1943, that it essentially didn't exist in the public consciousness. It wasn't until the early 1980s, nearly 40 years after the war ended, that Miller's poster was rediscovered and gradually, then explosively, became the image we now universally associate with Rosie the Riveter and women's empowerment. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand why Rosie the Riveter became such a powerful symbol, we need to understand the real women behind the legend. We need to explore their actual experiences in the factories and shipyards, the challenges they faced, the barriers they shattered, and the legacy they created. Because Rosie the Riveter wasn't just a poster or a song or even a painting. Rosie was 6 million American women who answered their country's call, transformed American industry, helped win the greatest war in history, and in the process, changed forever what it meant to be a woman in America. This is their story. This is how a symbol was born, forgotten, reborn, and became immortal. This is the untold depth of what made Rosie the Riveter the iconic symbol of World War II victory. The scope of America's manpower crisis in early 1942 was almost incomprehensible. Within months of Pearl Harbor, The Selective Service system was drafting men at a rate never before seen in American history. By the war's end, approximately 16 million American men would serve in uniform, roughly 11% of the entire U.S. population. These weren't just soldiers being pulled from unemployment lines. They were machinists, welders, electricians, carpenters, engineers, and skilled tradesmen, the very workers American industry needed most urgently to meet wartime production demands. The production targets that military planners established in 1942 seemed almost fantastical. President Roosevelt called for America to produce 60,000 aircraft in 1942 and 125,000 in 1943, numbers that industry leaders initially dismissed as impossible. The military also required 45,000 tanks, 20,000 anti-aircraft guns, and 8 million tons of shipping. To put this in perspective, in 1939, the entire American aircraft industry had produced fewer than 6,000 planes. Now Roosevelt was demanding production increases of more than 2,000% in just a few years. American industrial capacity would have to expand at a breakneck pace. Massive new factories were built seemingly overnight. The Willow Run plant outside Detroit, constructed by Ford to build B-24 Liberator bombers, became the largest factory under one roof in the world, covering 3.5 million square feet. The Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California, went from empty waterfront in 1940 to facilities employing more than 90,000 workers by 1943. Boeing's facilities in Seattle expanded dramatically to build B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-29 Superfortresses. But buildings and machinery alone couldn't win the war. These factories needed workers, and with military service claiming millions of men, there simply weren't enough male workers available. In 1941, before American entry into the war, unemployment stood at about 10%, a lingering effect of the Great Depression. That pool of unemployed workers was quickly absorbed into either military service or war production, and still the labor shortage intensified. Industry leaders and government officials faced a choice: either fundamentally compromise production targets, accepting that America might not be able to supply the weapons needed to win the war, or break with centuries of social convention and recruit women into heavy industrial work on a massive scale. There was really no choice at all. National survival demanded the unprecedented mobilization of female labor. The numbers tell an extraordinary story of transformation. In 1940, approximately 12 million women worked outside the home, representing about 24% of the workforce. By 1945, that number had surged to 19 million women in the workforce, representing about 37% of all workers. But even more significant than the total numbers was the type of work women were doing. Between 1940 and 1945, the number of women working in manufacturing increased by 460%. The number of women working in heavy industries, shipyards, aircraft plants, and ammunition factories increased from virtually zero to more than 2 million. By 1943, women made up 65% of the workforce in the aircraft industry. Think about that statistic for a moment. An industry that had employed almost no women before 1940 was now almost two-thirds female. At the Boeing plant in Seattle, women comprised 47% of the workforce by 1944. At some shipyards on the West Coast, women represented more than 60% of workers. This wasn't just a statistical shift, it was a complete revolution in American industrial organization and social structure. But recruiting women to work in factories was only half the battle. The other, perhaps more difficult challenge was changing American attitudes about women in the workplace, particularly in jobs that required physical strength, technical skill, and working in close proximity with men. This is where propaganda became a crucial weapon on the home front, and where our friend Rosie the Riveter enters the story as part of a carefully orchestrated campaign to reshape American culture. To appreciate how revolutionary the recruitment of women into war industries actually was, we need to understand the depth of the cultural barriers that had to be overcome. American society in the early 1940s operated under gender norms that had been reinforced for generations through religion, law, education, and popular culture. These norms weren't just preferences or suggestions. They were deeply embedded beliefs about the fundamental nature of men and women and their proper roles in society. The dominant ideology held that men and women were fundamentally different not just biologically, but in their capabilities, temperaments, and purposes. Men were seen as naturally suited for the public sphere, business, politics, and certainly heavy industry. They were characterized as strong, rational, aggressive, and competitive. Women, by contrast, were seen as naturally suited for the private sphere of home and family. They were characterized as nurturing, emotional, physically delicate, and in need of protection. These beliefs had real legal and economic consequences. In many states, married women could not own property in their own names or sign contracts without their husband's permission. Many employers, including most school districts, had policies requiring women to resign from their jobs when they married or became pregnant. Women were systematically excluded from most skilled trades through formal barriers and informal discrimination. Trade unions, which controlled access to many high-paying industrial jobs, typically prohibited female membership entirely. The pay disparity between men and women was not just accepted, but openly justified as natural and appropriate. Women were paid less than men for the same work based on the assumption that men were breadwinners supporting families, while women were either working temporarily before marriage or supplementing a husband's income. This wasn't hidden or considered shameful. It was the acknowledged and defended practice of American business. Popular culture reinforced these gender divisions constantly. Magazine articles, radio programs, films, and advertisements depicted women almost exclusively in domestic roles or in a narrow range of appropriate female occupations like secretary, teacher, nurse, or shop clerk. The few women who did work in male-dominated fields were often portrayed as either pitiable, forced to work because they lacked a man to support them, or as threatening career women who had abandoned their true calling for selfish ambition. Now, suddenly, the government needed to convince American women, and perhaps more importantly, their husbands, fathers, and brothers, that everything they'd been told about women's capabilities and proper roles was wrong. The campaign had to accomplish several things simultaneously. First, it had to convince women that they were physically capable of performing heavy industrial work that society had always told them only men could do. Second, it had to convince men to accept women as coworkers in industrial settings and to relinquish jobs they had traditionally monopolized. Third, and perhaps most delicately, it had to convince everyone that women working in factories was a temporary wartime necessity, not a permanent social change. This last point was crucial to the success of the propaganda campaign. If the government had explicitly argued that women's entry into war work represented a permanent transformation of gender roles, the campaign would have faced overwhelming resistance from conservative elements of American society. Instead, the messaging carefully emphasized that women were doing their patriotic duty during an emergency and would return to their traditional roles once the crisis passed. The propaganda walked a delicate line. Women were shown as competent and capable, but also as fundamentally unchanged in their essential femininity and domestic orientation. The government's propaganda effort operated on multiple fronts simultaneously. The Office of War Information coordinated with Hollywood to ensure that films featured positive portrayals of women in war work. Popular magazines like the Saturday Evening Post, Life, and Ladies' Home Journal ran stories celebrating the woman behind the man behind the gun. Radio programs featured dramatizations of women succeeding in factory work. Newspapers published articles with headlines like "Women Can Do Anything" and featured profiles of female welders, riveters, and Crane. The most effective propaganda wasn't produced by government agencies at all. It came from private companies working in partnership with the War Production Board. These were the recruitment posters that appeared in factories, on city buses, in shop windows, and on factory bulletin boards across America. Companies like Westinghouse, General Electric, Boeing, and Kaiser commissioned artists to create images celebrating the woman war worker. These posters had to walk that same delicate propaganda line. They needed to show women as strong and capable enough to do demanding industrial work, but not so strong or masculine that they threatened traditional gender norms. They needed to emphasize patriotic duty while downplaying economic independence. They needed to make factory work appear both important and temporary. J. Howard Miller's "We Can Do It" poster, commissioned by Westinghouse in late 1942, was one of many such images, part of a series designed to boost morale and reduce absenteeism among the company's workers. What made Miller's design stand out, though it wouldn't be recognized for decades, was its perfect distillation of this propaganda balance. The woman in the poster is undeniably strong, her flexed bicep showing actual muscle definition. Her direct gaze radiates confidence and determination. Yet she's also undeniably feminine, with her carefully styled hair beneath the bandana, her delicate features, and even her manicured nails. The message, "We can do it," is empowering without being threatening, a collective assertion rather than an individual demand. The genius of the poster, recognized only in retrospect, was how it managed to be simultaneously revolutionary and reassuring. It showed a woman doing something society had always said women couldn't do, while maintaining enough traditional markers of femininity to avoid provoking backlash. This delicate balance helps explain why, decades later, when Americans were looking for an image to represent women's empowerment, Miller's poster resonated so powerfully. But in February 1943, when the poster hung on that Westinghouse bulletin board for its brief 2-week appearance, nobody was thinking about its future iconic status. The workers who saw it were focused on more immediate concerns: meeting production quotas, earning their paychecks, and contributing to the war effort. Among those workers were thousands of women who had never imagined themselves working in a factory until Pearl Harbor changed everything. Their real stories of transformation, challenge, and achievement are even more remarkable than any propaganda poster could capture. For more than 70 years, one of American history's greatest mysteries remained unsolved. Who was the real woman who inspired the iconic image of Rosie the Riveter? Multiple women claimed to be the model for J. Howard Miller's "We Can Do It" poster, including Geraldine Hoff Doyle, whose claim was widely accepted for decades. But the truth, when it finally emerged in 2016, revealed a different woman entirely, a woman whose real story of wartime service had been overlooked for generations. Her name was Naomi Parker, and in 1942, she was a 20-year-old woman working as a waitress in a small restaurant, living an ordinary life that would have remained ordinary if not for Pearl Harbor. When the Navy opened the Naval Air Station in Alameda, California, to civilian workers, including women, Naomi and her sister Ada decided to apply. Neither had any industrial experience, but the Navy's training programs taught them quickly. Naomi was assigned to work in the machine shop, operating a large metal lathe, turning out precision parts for military aircraft. In 1942, a Navy photographer visited the Alameda facility to document war production. He captured an image of Naomi at her lathe, her hair wrapped in a red polka-dotted bandana to keep it safely away from the machinery. The photo shows her in profile, her face a picture of concentration as she works the controls of the massive machine. The image appeared in newspapers and military publications, one among thousands of similar propaganda photos celebrating women's contributions to the war effort. That photo, or more accurately its composition and spirit, likely inspired Miller when he created his poster a few months later. The red polka-dotted bandana, the determined expression, the sense of a woman fully engaged in demanding technical work, all these elements appear in both the photograph and Miller's iconic poster. But because Miller's poster was distributed so limitedly and then filed away, and because the photographer's image was one among thousands, the connection between Naomi Parker's photograph and the eventual Rosie the Riveter icon remained unknown for decades. Naomi herself continued working at the Naval Air Station throughout the war, eventually marrying a sailor she met there. After the war ended, like millions of other women, she left industrial work, raised a family, and lived a life far removed from the factories and shipyards of her youth. She saw Miller's poster when it was rediscovered and popularized in the 1980s, but like everyone else, she believed the various women who claimed to be its inspiration. It wasn't until 2009, when Naomi, then a widow named Naomi Parker Fraley in her late 80s, visited the World War II home front National Historical Park in Richmond, California, that the mystery began to unravel. She saw the photograph of herself at the lathe, but the caption identified the woman as someone else, one of the women who had falsely claimed to be Rosie. Naomi was shocked and frustrated. She tried to correct the record, contacting the museum and various historians, but without definitive proof, her claims were treated skeptically. Finally, in 2016, Seton Hall University professor James J. Kimball, who had been researching the history of the Rosie the Riveter image for years, discovered evidence that conclusively proved Naomi Parker Fraley was the woman in the photograph. He traced the photo through military archives, matched it with contemporary newspaper clippings, and demonstrated that previous identifications had been based on misattributed images. At last, at age 95, Naomi received recognition as the real woman behind one of history's most famous images. Tragically, Naomi passed away in January 2018, just 2 years after finally receiving acknowledgement. But in those final years, she got to see her story told accurately, her contribution to history recognized. In interviews during that period, Naomi spoke not just about her own work, but about the millions of women who, like her, had done their part during the war and then returned to normal life without recognition or fanfare. Her story reveals something crucial about Rosie the Riveter that's often overlooked in the mythology. Rosie wasn't a superhero or an exceptional individual. She was an ordinary woman who did extraordinary things because her country needed her. Naomi Parker went from serving food to operating precision machinery in a matter of months. She learned skills that had been considered too difficult or too dangerous for women. She proved, along with millions of others, that capability isn't determined by gender, but by opportunity and training. While Naomi Parker Fraley may have been the woman in the photograph that inspired Miller's poster, other women had equally valid claims to embodying the spirit of Rosie the Riveter, particularly 2 women whose names were actually Rosewell Monroe and May Cryer. Rosewell Monroe was born in Kentucky in 1920, one of 8 children in a poor rural family. By age 17, she was married, and by 19, she was a widow with 2 young daughters after her husband died in a car accident. In 1942, desperate for work that could support her family, Rose heard about high-paying jobs at the Willow Run bomber plant outside Detroit. She left Kentucky, moved to Michigan, found someone to care for her daughters during work hours, and applied for a job riveting B-24 Liberator bombers. The Willow Run plant was one of the industrial wonders of the war. Built by Ford Motor Company on farmland west of Detroit, it was the largest factory under one roof anywhere in the world, covering more than 3.5 million square feet. The main assembly line stretched nearly a mile in length, and at peak production, the plant was completing one B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. The B-24 Liberator was one of the war's most important aircraft, serving in every theater of combat, and Willow Run produced more than 8,600 of them between 1942 and 1945. Rose worked as a riveter, one of the most physically demanding jobs in aircraft production. Riveting involved using a pneumatic gun that fired metal rivets at tremendous force, securing aluminum panels to the aircraft's frame. The work required strength to handle the heavy rivet gun, precision to place rivets correctly, and stamina to maintain concentration during 10-hour shifts. Rose became skilled enough that she was often assigned to work inside the aircraft's fuselage or wings, tight spaces where only smaller workers could fit. In 1944, when the government was producing propaganda films to encourage war bond purchases and continued war production, filmmakers visited Willow Run looking for photogenic women workers to feature. They found Rose Monroe, with her striking features and obvious competence at her job. Rose appeared in promotional films and was even featured singing a version of the popular Rosie the Riveter song. She became one of the few real Rosies to be publicly identified with the Rosie the Riveter phenomenon during the actual war years. After the war, Rose was one of the women who refused to quietly return to traditional female employment. She used skills and money she had earned at Willow Run to start her own construction and taxi business in Indiana. She drove a taxi for years, operated heavy equipment, and remained fiercely independent until her death in 1997 at age 77. In her later years, she gave interviews about her wartime experiences, always emphasizing that she had been one among thousands of women doing the same work. Mae Cryer's story follows a similar arc but took place on the other side of the country at Boeing's facilities in Seattle. Born in 1921 in North Dakota, Mae was working as a waitress when war broke out. In 1943, she traveled to Seattle where Boeing was desperately recruiting workers to build B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-29 Superfortresses. Mae was trained as a riveter and worked on B-17 production, driving thousands of rivets into the iconic bomber that became known as the Flying Fortress. Boeing's operation was nearly as massive as Willow Run. The company employed more than 50,000 workers at its Seattle facilities by 1944, and nearly half of them were women. Mae worked alongside thousands of other women, many of whom, like her, had come from far away to take these well-paying industrial jobs. The work was grueling, the hours were long, and the pressure was intense, but Mae later recalled feeling a tremendous sense of purpose. Every rivet she drove brought another bomber closer to completion, and every bomber meant more protection for American troops. What makes Mae's story particularly remarkable is her longevity and her dedication to preserving the memory of women war workers. Unlike many Rosies who preferred to move on after the war, Mae remained proud of her service throughout her life. In her 90s, she became a passionate advocate for recognizing women's contributions to the war effort. She lobbied Congress to award a Congressional Gold Medal to Rosie the Riveters, legislation that finally passed in 2009. She attended Rosie the Riveter conventions, gave countless interviews, and became a living link to that transformative period in American history. Mae emphasized in her advocacy that Rosie represented more than just women in war work. She represented a moment when American women proved they could do anything, when barriers that had stood for centuries came crashing down, and when women's capabilities were finally recognized. May lived to see her 100th birthday in 2021 and remained active in remembering and honoring Rosie the Riveters until her passing in 2022. These three women, Naomi Parker Freely, Rose Monroe, and May Cryer, represent millions of American women whose names history never recorded but whose contributions were just as vital. They came from diverse backgrounds, but they shared common experiences. The shock of entering a previously all-male industrial world, the challenge of mastering complex skills quickly, the pride of doing difficult work well, and the knowledge that their labor was directly contributing to victory. Their stories also reveal the complexity often missing from simplified narratives about Rosie the Riveter. These women weren't just symbols of empowerment. They were real people navigating extraordinary circumstances, facing discrimination and hardship even as they broke barriers. To understand the full meaning of Rosie the Riveter as an icon, we need to explore not just the propaganda, but the reality of women's wartime industrial work, with all its triumphs and challenges. Before there was a poster, before there was Norman Rockwell's iconic painting, there was a song. In 1942, American songwriters Red Evans and John Jacob Loeb composed a catchy tune called Rosie the Riveter that would become one of the war's most popular musical propaganda pieces. The song told the story of a fictional defense worker named Rosie, who spent her days at a munitions factory doing her part to protect her boyfriend Charlie, who was far, far away fighting overseas. The lyrics painted Rosie as both capable and traditionally feminine, a delicate balance that characterized much wartime propaganda about women workers. She was making history, working for victory, clearly competent at industrial work. But the song also emphasized that she was motivated primarily by love and loyalty to her man, not by economic independence or career ambition. This framing was crucial for making the idea of women factory workers palatable to a society that still believed a woman's primary role was supporting men and family. The song became a genuine hit, played on radio stations across the country and recorded by several popular artists. The Four Vagabonds version, in particular, climbed the music charts in 1942 and 1943. Americans who might never see a defense plant or meet a woman factory worker were singing about Rosie the Riveter, absorbing the message that women in war work were patriotic, admirable, and feminine. What the song accomplished was creating a cultural touchstone, a name and concept that other propaganda efforts could build upon. Rosie the Riveter became shorthand for all American women in war industries. When Norman Rockwell decided to paint a cover for the Saturday Evening Post celebrating women defense workers in May 1943, he titled it Rosie the Riveter, explicitly referencing the song that everyone knew. When J. Howard Miller designed his poster for Westinghouse, he probably had the song in mind as well, though his poster wouldn't be explicitly connected to the Rosie name until decades later. The song's success demonstrated the power of popular culture as a propaganda tool. Government agencies could produce posters and newsreels, but a catchy song that Americans voluntarily sang and enjoyed was far more effective at shaping attitudes. The song normalized the idea of women in defense work, making it seem not just acceptable but admirable and patriotic. In late 1942, the Westinghouse Electric Company's War Production Coordinating Committee commissioned Pittsburgh artist J. Howard Miller to create a series of posters for display in company facilities. Westinghouse had transitioned from civilian electrical equipment to war production and now employed thousands of women in jobs that had been exclusively male before the war. The company wanted posters that would boost morale, reduce absenteeism, and encourage productivity. Miller created several posters for Westinghouse as part of this campaign, but one in particular would eventually transcend its origins to become one of the most recognizable images in American history. The poster featured a woman in a blue work shirt and red polka-dotted bandana, her right arm flexed to show a muscular bicep, her face turned toward the viewer with an expression of confidence and determination. Above her head, in bold white letters on a bright yellow background, was the message, "We can do it." The design was deceptively simple, but carefully calculated for maximum impact. The color palette was limited but bold, the red, white, and blue evoking the American flag and patriotic duty. The woman's pose was dynamic and assertive, the flexed bicep a universal symbol of strength. Her direct gaze engaged viewers personally, making the poster's message feel like a direct communication rather than distant propaganda. But crucially, the poster maintained elements of traditional femininity even while depicting strength and capability. The woman's face, while determined, was also conventionally attractive, with carefully applied makeup and well-maintained eyebrows. Her hair, though covered by the practical bandana, was clearly styled underneath. Even her fingernails appeared manicured, a small detail that signaled she remained feminine despite her industrial work. The text, "We can do it," was equally calculated. The collective "we" made the message feel inclusive and collaborative rather than threatening or confrontational. It didn't say, "I can do anything a man can do," or make explicit claims about gender equality. Instead, it simply asserted capability, allowing viewers to interpret the specific meaning themselves. The poster appeared on Westinghouse bulletin boards in February 1943, displayed for approximately 2 weeks before being replaced by other posters in Miller's series. It was never widely distributed beyond Westinghouse facilities. It never appeared in national magazines, in recruiting campaigns, or in government propaganda efforts. The limited print run meant that very few Americans during the war years ever saw Miller's poster. This is one of history's fascinating ironies. The poster that would eventually become the most iconic representation of women's empowerment and wartime contribution was seen by perhaps a few thousand Westinghouse workers for 2 weeks in 1943, then disappeared into company archives for nearly 4 decades. During the war and for decades afterward, when Americans thought of Rosie the Riveter, they were thinking not of Miller's poster, but of Norman Rockwell's very different image. Rockwell's Rosie the Riveter, which appeared on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post on May 29, 1943, just a few months after Miller's poster briefly appeared at Westinghouse, was instantly famous and widely distributed. The Saturday Evening Post was one of America's most popular magazines, appearing in millions of homes every week. Rockwell's painting showed a muscular, working-class woman in coveralls and work shirt, taking her lunch break with a rivet gun across her lap, her feet planted firmly on a crushed copy of Hitler's Mein Kampf. Rockwell's Rosie was deliberately modeled on Michelangelo's Prophets from the Sistine Chapel, lending her classical dignity and monumentality. She was undeniably powerful, with well-developed arm muscles and a confident posture. But she was also approachable and human, eating a sandwich and wearing a badge that read Rosie in case viewers missed the reference. Rockwell's image dominated American consciousness about Rosie the Riveter for more than 40 years. So how did Miller's forgotten poster eventually eclipse Rockwell's famous painting to become the definitive image of Rosie the Riveter? The answer involves a combination of changing social movements, archival rediscovery, and the poster's particular resonance with late 20th century feminism. But before we can understand Rosie's rebirth, we need to understand what happened to the real women who inspired these images once the war ended. The journey from civilian life to war worker was both exhilarating and intimidating for millions of American women. Most had no industrial experience whatsoever. They had worked as teachers, secretaries, waitresses, or homemakers. The idea of operating heavy machinery, working with dangerous tools, or climbing inside aircraft fuselages was completely foreign. But American industry, facing desperate labor shortages, developed intensive training programs to transform housewives and shop clerks into skilled industrial workers in a matter of weeks. These programs were revolutionary in themselves, proving that the skilled trades that unions and employers had claimed required years of apprenticeship could actually be taught quickly and effectively when there was sufficient motivation. The training varied by industry and employer, but typically lasted anywhere from a few days to several weeks. Women learned to read blueprints, operate welding torches, drive rivets, use precision measuring tools, and follow complex assembly procedures. At Boeing's training facility in Seattle, women spent 2 weeks learning aircraft riveting techniques before being assigned to production lines. At the Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California, workers could receive training in more than a dozen different skilled trades. The numbers of women entering these previously all-male industries were staggering. In the aircraft industry, female employment skyrocketed from virtually zero in 1940 to 310,000 by 1943, representing 65% of the industry's workforce. At Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California, 1/3 of the 90,000-person workforce were women by 1943. At some West Coast shipyards, women made up 60% of workers. These women performed every type of industrial work. They welded ship hulls, riveted aircraft fuselages, operated massive cranes, drove forklifts, assembled engines, tested electrical systems, and worked as inspectors, ensuring quality control. The propaganda image of women doing light assembly work while men did heavy labor was largely fiction. Women operated the same equipment, worked the same hours, and performed the same tasks as their male coworkers. The work was demanding, dangerous, and often uncomfortable. Shipyards and aircraft plants were noisy, dirty, and in the summer, swelteringly hot. Workers handled heavy materials, worked with hazardous chemicals, and faced constant risk of injury from machinery, falling objects, or burns from welding. Medical records from Kaiser Shipyard show that women suffered the same occupational injuries and illnesses as male workers: respiratory problems from paint fumes and metal dust, burns, cuts, bruises, and musculoskeletal strain from repetitive motion and heavy lifting. The work shifts were grueling. Most defense plants operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Workers typically worked 10-hour shifts, 6 days a week, for a total of 60 hours weekly. Some plants operated on 3 8-hour shifts, while others used 2 12-hour shifts. Night shifts were particularly challenging for women who had to balance work with family responsibilities and who faced potential harassment during late-night commutes. Despite the challenges, many women found the work deeply satisfying. For the first time in their lives, they were earning substantial wages, learning valuable skills, and contributing directly to the war effort. Letters and diaries from the period reveal women's pride in mastering complex technical work and their sense of purpose in knowing their labor was helping protect American troops overseas. The wages, while still lower than what men earned, were significantly higher than what most women could earn in traditional female occupations. A woman who had earned perhaps 25 cents an hour as a waitress or domestic worker could earn 75 cents to $1 an hour in a defense plant. For many women, particularly working-class women and women of color who had been confined to the lowest-paying jobs, more work represented unprecedented economic opportunity. At Kaiser Shipyards in Richmond, California, which became famous for its progressive labor policies and rapid ship construction, the company actively recruited women and provided support services that other employers often neglected. Kaiser built housing for war workers, operated cafeterias that served hot meals around the clock, and even established company stores where workers could purchase goods despite wartime shortages. The Richmond shipyards became a model for how American industry could successfully integrate women into heavy industrial work. Between 1942 and 1945, Kaiser's Richmond shipyards built 747 ships, an astonishing production record that was achieved largely because of the company's efficient use of its diverse workforce, including tens of thousands of women. The company's most famous achievement was building the Liberty ship SS Robert E. Peary in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes from keel laying to launch, a world record that still stands. Women workers were integral to this achievement, working alongside men in every phase of ship construction. Documentary photographer Dorothea Lange visited the Richmond shipyards in 1942 and 1943, creating a remarkable visual record of women at work. Her photographs show women welding, riveting, operating cranes, and performing every type of shipyard labor. The images are striking because they show women completely absorbed in their work, focusing intently on technical tasks with clear competence. These weren't posed propaganda shots, but real documentation of women's actual contributions to war production. The transformation of American women from traditional roles to industrial workers happened with remarkable speed. In less than 3 years, millions of women who had never imagined themselves capable of such work became skilled industrial laborers. They proved, in the most concrete terms possible, that gender roles were social constructs rather than biological inevitabilities. The skills required for industrial work, which society had always claimed only men possessed, turned out to be easily teachable to anyone given proper training and opportunity. The propaganda posters and patriotic songs celebrated women's contributions to war production, but they rarely mentioned the exhausting reality that most women war workers faced, the double shift. While male workers returned home after 10 hours in the factory to rest, most women war workers came home to a second full-time job, managing their households, preparing meals, caring for children, and handling all the domestic labor that society still expected women to perform regardless of their employment status. This double burden was particularly acute for married women with children, who represented a growing proportion of the female war workforce as the war continued. In 1940, only about 15% of married women worked outside the home. By 1945, that figure had risen to nearly 24%. Many of these women had young children, a situation that created enormous logistical and emotional challenges. Childcare was perhaps the single greatest obstacle to women's full participation in war work. Before the war, most American women with young children did not work outside the home, so there was virtually no infrastructure for large-scale childcare. Extended family networks traditionally provided childcare when mothers needed help, but with families scattered by war mobilization and with grandmothers and aunts often working themselves, these informal systems broke down. The federal government, recognizing that inadequate childcare was limiting women's availability for war work, took the unprecedented step of funding public childcare centers. Under the Lanham Act, Congress authorized funding for childcare facilities near defense plants, the first large-scale federal childcare program in American history. By 1945, more than 3,000 childcare centers serving more than 130,000 children had been established under this program. Kaiser shipyards in Richmond again led the way with innovative solutions. The company built 2 large childcare centers directly at the shipyard gates, allowing mothers to drop off their children on their way to work and pick them up at the end of their shifts. The centers operated 24 hours a day to accommodate all shifts and provided not just basic supervision, but also educational activities, nutritious meals, and even medical care. At their peak, Kaiser's child care centers in Richmond served more than 1,000 children daily. But even these pioneering programs served only a fraction of the women who needed childcare assistance. Most women had to cobble together informal arrangements, leaving children with neighbors, relatives, or older siblings, paying for private care they could barely afford, or in some desperate cases, leaving children unsupervised during working hours. The stress of worrying about children's safety and well-being while working long shifts in dangerous conditions added an enormous mental burden to the already demanding physical work. Beyond childcare, women war workers faced the exhausting reality that domestic labor didn't disappear just because they now worked outside the home. Despite working 50 or 60 hours a week in defense plants, women were still expected to clean their homes, cook meals, do laundry, shop for groceries, a time-consuming challenge during wartime rationing, and handle all the other tasks associated with household management. American men, for the most part, did not significantly increase their participation in domestic labor to compensate for their wives' employment. Women's magazines during the war offered cheerful advice about how to manage this impossible workload. Articles suggested efficient housekeeping methods, quick recipes, and ways to maintain an attractive appearance despite long work hours. The underlying message was that women could and should do it all, contribute to victory through paid labor while still fulfilling all traditional domestic responsibilities. The possibility that men might share housework and childcare was rarely mentioned. The physical exhaustion of this double shift contributed to higher rates of absenteeism among women workers, a fact that employers and propaganda campaigns blamed on women's supposed lack of commitment rather than on the impossibility of working effectively while severely sleep-deprived and overwhelmed. Women who missed work to care for sick children or to handle household emergencies were criticized as insufficiently patriotic, while men who missed work faced no such moral judgment. In addition to the physical demands of the double shift, women war workers faced persistent discrimination and harassment in the workplace. Despite their critical importance to war production, women were not welcomed as equals by many male coworkers and supervisors. Some men resented women's presence in jobs they considered masculine territory. Others saw women's employment as a temporary wartime necessity that would and should end as soon as possible. Sexual harassment was pervasive and largely unaddressed. Women reported unwanted comments, touching, and propositions from male coworkers and supervisors. There were no legal protections against sexual harassment, no formal complaint procedures, and no terminology to even describe these experiences as a form of discrimination. Women who complained were often blamed for encouraging attention or told to toughen up. The wage gap between male and female workers persisted throughout the war despite government rhetoric about equal pay for equal work. Although the National War Labor Board officially endorsed the principle of equal pay in 1942, enforcement was minimal and loopholes were substantial. Employers found ways to classify men's and women's jobs slightly differently to justify paying women less. On average, women in war industries earned about 60% of what men earned for comparable work. Some women and their unions fought back against wage discrimination. In 1945, women workers at a General Motors plant in Detroit went on strike demanding equal pay, one of the first strikes in American history organized around gender pay equity. The United Electrical Workers Union, which represented many defense plant workers, made equal pay a priority and won some significant victories. These struggles planted seeds for the equal pay movement that would gain momentum decades later. Despite all these challenges, discrimination, harassment, exhaustion, and inadequate support, millions of American women continued showing up to their war work shifts day after day, year after year. They welded ships, riveted bombers, assembled tanks, and manufactured ammunition, all while managing households and raising children. Their resilience and determination under these conditions is perhaps the most impressive part of the Rosie the Riveter story, a dimension often lost in simplified narratives that focus only on empowerment without acknowledging the real struggles these women faced. The production statistics from American industry during World War II remain almost incomprehensible in their scale. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States manufactured approximately 300,000 aircraft, 88,000 tanks, 2,700 Liberty ships, 120,000 other naval vessels, 372,000 artillery pieces, 47 million tons of ammunition, and countless other weapons and supplies. This industrial output exceeded the combined production of Germany, Japan, and Italy by a substantial margin. To understand how remarkable this achievement was, consider that in 1939, the entire American aircraft industry consisted of a few small companies employing about 40,000 workers and producing fewer than 6,000 planes annually. By 1944, the aircraft industry employed more than 2 million workers and was producing more than 96,000 planes per year, a 1,500% increase in production. Female workers were central to this transformation, making up 65% of the aircraft industry workforce by 1943. The B-24 Liberator bomber, built primarily at Ford's Willow Run plant where Rose Monroe worked, illustrates this production miracle. The B-24 was one of the most complex machines of its era, consisting of more than 450,000 individual parts that had to be precisely manufactured and assembled. Each plane required approximately 400,000 rivets, most of them installed by hand using pneumatic rivet guns. At peak efficiency in 1944, Willow Run was producing one complete B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. By war's end, Willow Run had built 8,685 B-24s, representing about half of all Liberators produced. The shipbuilding achievement was equally impressive. Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California, pioneered mass production techniques adapted from automobile manufacturing. Instead of building ships in traditional ways, with workers gradually constructing each vessel from keel to deck, Kaiser used prefabrication methods. Large sections of ships were built simultaneously in different parts of the shipyard, then brought together and welded into place. This approach dramatically reduced construction time. The standard Liberty ship, a cargo vessel designed to transport war materials to Europe and the Pacific, normally took about 230 days to build using traditional methods. Kaiser reduced this to an average of 42 days. The company's record-setting construction of the SS Robert E. Peary in less than 5 days was a publicity stunt, but even this exceptional pace was built on the foundation of techniques that Kaiser's workforce, including thousands of women, had mastered. These production achievements had direct military consequences. American air superiority in both the European and Pacific theaters was built on quantitative advantage as much as qualitative superiority. American bomber formations could absorb losses and continue operations because replacement aircraft were arriving constantly from factories back home. The Liberty ships that Kaiser and other shipyards produced in such incredible numbers ensured that American and Allied forces never lacked for supplies, no matter how far from home they fought. The contribution of women workers to these production totals was not just significant, but absolutely essential. Without the influx of 6 million women into the workforce during the war, American industry simply could not have met production targets. The mathematics were inescapable, with 16 million men in uniform and production requirements increasing by orders of magnitude. There was no other available labor pool. But women's contribution wasn't just about filling empty positions. Multiple studies conducted during and after the war found that women workers were as productive as male workers and sometimes more so. At Boeing's Seattle plant, production managers noted that women were particularly adept at precision work requiring attention to detail and manual dexterity. In aircraft assembly, where tolerances were extremely tight and errors could be catastrophic, women's careful workmanship became highly valued. The contrast with America's enemies makes women's contributions even more significant. Nazi Germany, despite facing equally severe labor shortages, largely refused to mobilize women for industrial work on a comparable scale. Adolf Hitler's ideology emphasized women's role as mothers and homemakers. Even as the German war economy desperately needed workers, Nazi leaders resisted large-scale recruitment of German women into factories, relying instead on forced labor from occupied territories. This ideological rigidity limited German production capacity. Imperial Japan similarly failed to effectively mobilize women for war production. Japanese women did work in some industries, but traditional gender roles remained largely unchanged, and the scale of female industrial employment never approached American levels. Japan's industrial production lagged far behind American output throughout the war, a disparity that became increasingly significant as the conflict progressed. American willingness to mobilize women for war work, however reluctant and incomplete it may have been, provided a crucial advantage over enemies who let ideology prevent them from fully utilizing their populations. The American home front's flexibility and pragmatism, embodied by the millions of women who entered defense plans, contributed directly to Allied victory. The experience of doing demanding industrial work successfully had profound effects on the women themselves and on broader American attitudes about women's capabilities. Women who had been told their entire lives that they were too weak, too emotional, or too intellectually limited for technical work proved these beliefs false through their daily accomplishments. Learning to read blueprints, operate precision measuring instruments, and master complex machinery required exactly the kind of analytical thinking and spatial reasoning that society had always claimed women lacked. Women welders had to understand metallurgy, temperature control, and structural integrity. Women electricians had to grasp circuit theory and troubleshoot complex systems. Women inspectors had to make critical quality control decisions that could mean the difference between safe equipment and catastrophic failure. The confidence that came from mastering these skills was transformative for many women. Oral histories collected from women war workers decades later consistently emphasize this theme: the pride of doing difficult work well, of being trusted with important responsibilities, of proving that they were just as capable as men had always been. This wasn't abstract empowerment. It was concrete knowledge gained through direct experience. Some male coworkers and supervisors, witnessing women's competence firsthand, revised their attitudes about women's capabilities. While discrimination and resentment certainly persisted, there were also instances of genuine respect and mentorship. Skilled male workers who had initially been skeptical sometimes became strong advocates for their female trainees after seeing them master the work. The unions that represented defense workers had complex and often contradictory relationships with women members. Some unions, particularly the United Electrical Workers and the United Auto Workers, actively fought for women's rights to equal pay and fair treatment. These unions recognized that women workers were a permanent part of the industrial workforce and that supporting women's rights served the interests of all workers. They bargained for equal pay provisions, challenged discriminatory seniority systems, and provided platforms for women to voice their concerns. Other unions were less supportive, viewing women as temporary workers who would return home after the war and whose presence might threaten men's wages and job security. These unions sometimes collaborated with employers to maintain separate job classifications and pay scales for men and women, or negotiated contracts that made women vulnerable to layoffs when the war ended. Despite mixed support from unions and ongoing discrimination, women war workers developed a strong sense of solidarity among themselves. They formed informal networks of mutual support, sharing information about which supervisors were fair, which jobs paid better, and how to navigate the male-dominated workplace. They carpooled together, ate lunch together, and developed friendships that sometimes lasted lifetimes. African American women faced particular challenges and demonstrated particular resilience. Before the war, Black women were largely confined to the lowest-paying domestic service jobs. War industries initially resisted hiring Black women even as they recruited white women. It often took direct pressure from civil rights organizations and government fair employment agencies before defense contractors would hire African American women. Once hired, Black women faced double discrimination based on both race and gender. They were often assigned to the most difficult or dangerous jobs, paid less than white women doing identical work, and excluded from company facilities like cafeterias and restrooms. Yet despite these obstacles, more than 600,000 African American women worked in war industries by 1945, a dramatic increase from pre-war employment patterns. For Black women, war work represented not just a challenge to gender barriers, but also a challenge to racial hierarchies. Earning good wages, learning skilled trades, and working alongside white women, even if not always as equals, opened possibilities that had been completely foreclosed before the war. The experience of war work would influence many Black women who later participated in the civil rights movement. The workplace revolution of World War II was incomplete and contradictory. Women gained access to jobs and wages previously denied them, but they faced ongoing discrimination, harassment, and the expectation that they would voluntarily surrender these opportunities when the war ended. They proved their capabilities beyond any doubt, but this proof didn't immediately translate into permanent social change. Yet the experience mattered profoundly. 6 million American women discovered capabilities they hadn't known they possessed. Millions more absorbed the message that women could do work society had always deemed impossible for them. This knowledge couldn't be erased, even when powerful forces tried to push women back into traditional roles after the war ended. August 15, 1945, Victory over Japan Day. The most devastating war in human history was finally over. Across America, millions of people poured into the streets in spontaneous celebrations. In Times Square, in small-town main streets, in factory parking lots, Americans embraced, cried, and rejoiced that their loved ones would be coming home. For women war workers, however, VJ Day marked not just the end of a war, but the beginning of a profound personal crisis that has often been overlooked in historical narratives. Within days of Japan's surrender, defense contractors began laying off workers. The cancellation of military contracts meant that the massive industrial infrastructure built to support the war effort was suddenly unnecessary. Plants that had operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, shut down entire shifts or closed completely. Millions of workers lost their jobs in a matter of weeks. But the layoffs were not distributed equally. Employers systematically laid off women first, implementing last hired, first fired policies that disproportionately affected female workers who had only entered industrial employment during the war years. At Ford's Willow Run plant, where Roswell Monroe had helped build B-24 bombers. 85% of women workers were laid off compared to just 65% of men. Similar patterns played out across the country. The scale of the displacement was enormous. Between August 1945 and February 1946, more than 2.2 million women lost their jobs in non-farm employment alone. In manufacturing, where women had made their most dramatic wartime gains, female employment dropped by 26% in just the first year after the war ended. Women who had worked as welders, riveters, machinists, and electricians found themselves unemployed and, more significantly, barred from returning to similar work. The displacement wasn't just about reduced production needs. Employers, unions, and government policies actively worked to remove women from industrial jobs to make room for returning veterans. Seniority systems that should have protected many women workers were waived or reinterpreted to favor men. Union contracts that defense workers had negotiated during the war, some of which included equal pay provisions and protections against gender discrimination, were renegotiated or simply ignored. Labor unions, which had represented millions of women during the war, largely abandoned their female members after VJ Day. Most unions viewed women as temporary workers who had filled in during an emergency and should now step aside for men who needed to support families. The fact that many women war workers were also supporting families, either as single mothers, widows, or wives of disabled veterans, was conveniently overlooked. Government policies reinforced this mass displacement. The GI Bill, which provided education and training benefits to returning veterans, was available only to those who had served in the military, effectively excluding almost all women. Veterans received preferential treatment in hiring for government jobs and for positions at companies with government contracts. The War Manpower Commission, which had aggressively recruited women into defense work, now encouraged them to return home. Popular culture participated in this effort to push women out of industrial work and back into domestic roles. Magazines that had celebrated Rosie the Riveter during the war now ran articles about the joys of homemaking and the importance of women creating comfortable homes for returning veterans. Women who wanted to continue working were portrayed as selfish, unwilling to make room for men who had sacrificed for their country. But here's a crucial fact that often gets lost in narratives about the post-war period. Most women war workers did not want to quit. Surveys conducted in 1944 and 1945 found that between 61 and 85% of women in war industries wanted to continue working after the war ended. They had grown accustomed to the independence and financial security that employment provided. They had developed skills and professional identities. Many needed the income to support themselves and their families. African American women in particular resisted being pushed back into domestic service. Before the war, the vast majority of employed Black women worked as domestic servants, earning minimal wages in positions that offered no security, benefits, or dignity. War work had provided an escape from this exploitation. Black women fought hard, often successfully, to find post-war employment in factories, laundries, and other industrial settings rather than returning to domestic service. The story of what happened to America's female workforce after 1945 is more complex than simple displacement suggests. While women were pushed out of high-paying industrial jobs, many found employment elsewhere. By 1950, female labor force participation had nearly returned to wartime levels, though women were now concentrated in clerical work, retail, service industries, and other traditionally female occupations rather than in manufacturing. This shift represented both continuity and change. Women had proven they wanted and needed to work, and many refused to return entirely to domestic life despite enormous social pressure. The war had transformed women's expectations, and expanded their sense of possibilities. At the same time, the immediate post-war period saw women channeled back into gender-segregated occupations, recreating many of the limitations that had existed before the war. For individual women, the transition was often painful and frustrating. May Cryer, the Boeing riveter, later recalled the bitterness of being told her services were no longer needed after years of hard work and dedication. Roswell Monroe refused to accept traditional female employment and instead started her own businesses, maintaining the independence she had discovered during the war. Naomi Parker Fraley, like millions of others, returned to more conventional work, though she never forgot the sense of capability and purpose she had felt working on aircraft at the Alameda Naval Air Station. The immediate post-war years represented a lost opportunity. The barriers to women's full participation in the economy that had been broken during the war were hastily reconstructed. The skills and confidence that women had developed were treated as wartime aberrations rather than permanent gains. Rosie the Riveter, who had been celebrated as a patriotic hero during the war, was now portrayed as someone who had done her duty and should gracefully retire. But the experience couldn't be entirely erased. 6 million women had discovered capabilities they didn't know they possessed. Millions more had absorbed the message that women could do work society had always deemed impossible. This knowledge would lie dormant for years, but it would eventually resurface in new movements for women's rights and gender equality. The seeds planted during World War II would eventually grow into the feminist movements of the 1960s and beyond. As for the propaganda imagery that had celebrated Rosie the Riveter during the war, it largely disappeared along with the women themselves. Norman Rockwell's painting was filed away in the archives of the Saturday Evening Post. Howard Miller's "We Can Do It" poster, which had been seen by so few people during its brief appearance, was completely forgotten, lost in Westinghouse Company files. For nearly 40 years, Rosie the Riveter existed primarily as a fading memory in the minds of the women who had lived that experience. But memories, even fading ones, have a way of resurfacing when the time is right. The story of how Rosie the Riveter was reborn decades after the war ended reveals as much about American society in the 1980s as it does about the 1940s. For nearly 40 years after World War II ended, Howard Miller's "We Can Do It" poster remained buried in archives, unknown to the American public. The women who had been Rosie the Riveters went about their lives, raising families, working in various occupations, rarely talking about their wartime experiences in an era that seemed determined to forget that women had ever worked in factories and shipyards. If Americans thought about Rosie the Riveter at all during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, they remembered Norman Rockwell's muscular working woman from the Saturday Evening Post, if they remembered anything at all. Then, in the early 1980s, something remarkable happened. As the women's movement of the 1970s evolved into what scholars call second-wave feminism, activists and historians began searching for powerful images from American history that could represent women's strength and capability. They wanted symbols that showed women as strong, competent, and independent, not as victims or subordinates. Someone discovered Miller's forgotten poster in the archives. The timing was perfect. The poster's bold simplicity, the woman's direct gaze and flexed muscle, the confident message, "We can do it," resonated powerfully with a generation of women fighting for workplace equality, reproductive rights, and social recognition. The image began appearing in feminist publications, on protest signs, and in women's studies courses. By the mid-1980s, Miller's poster had been adopted as an icon of the feminist movement. In 1982, the image appeared on the cover of Smithsonian Magazine in an article about women's contributions to World War II. This mainstream exposure launched the poster into widespread public consciousness. Suddenly, the image that had been seen by perhaps a few thousand Westinghouse workers for 2 weeks in 1943 was being reproduced millions of times. It appeared on t-shirts, coffee mugs, posters, and in countless advertisements. More significantly, it became instantly recognizable as a symbol of female empowerment. What made Miller's poster so effective as a feminist icon, more so than Rockwell's equally powerful painting, was its ambiguity and adaptability. Rockwell's Rosie was clearly situated in a specific historical moment, eating her lunch at a wartime factory with Mein Kampf crushed under her feet. Miller's image was more abstract and universal. The woman could be any woman at any time, facing any challenge. The message, "We can do it," could apply to any struggle for equality or recognition. The poster's transformation from corporate morale booster to feminist icon involved a fascinating historical irony. During the war, the poster had been part of a propaganda campaign designed to temporarily expand women's roles while reassuring society that traditional gender norms would ultimately be preserved. For decades later, that same image was being used to argue for the permanent transformation of gender roles and the fundamental equality of women and men. The poster's meaning had been completely inverted. This reappropriation demonstrates the power of visual symbolism and how images can take on meanings far beyond their creator's intentions. Miller designed his poster for a narrow corporate purpose in 1943. In the 1980s and beyond, his image became a universal symbol of women's strength, appearing in contexts that would have been unimaginable to its creator: feminist protests, labor rights campaigns, political movements around the world. The rediscovery of the poster also sparked renewed interest in the actual history of women war workers. Historians began conducting oral history projects, interviewing aging Rosies about their wartime experiences. Museums established exhibits celebrating women's contributions to the war effort. In 2000, Congress established the Rosie the Riveter /World War II Home Front National Historical Park in Richmond, California, at the site of the old Kaiser shipyards, preserving the memory of women's wartime industrial work. In 2009, after years of advocacy led by women like May Cryer, Congress awarded the Congressional Gold Medal to women who had worked in defense industries during World War II, finally giving official recognition to contributions that had been overlooked for decades. May, then in her late 80s, attended the ceremony in Washington, wearing her original Boeing identification badge, proud to see her generation of women finally honored. The search for the real women who had inspired the iconic images also intensified. For years, several women claimed to be the model for Miller's poster. The confusion persisted until 2016, when Professor James J. Kimball definitively identified Naomi Parker Fraley as the woman whose photograph had inspired Miller. Naomi, then 95, finally received recognition she had sought for years, though she humbly insisted she was just one among millions who had done the same work. Today, the "We Can Do It" image is one of the most recognizable in American history, arguably more famous than the Statue of Liberty or Uncle Sam. It has been reproduced, parroted, referenced, and reinterpreted countless times. It appears in political campaigns across the political spectrum, in commercial advertising, in social media memes, and in movements for social justice around the world. The image has transcended its origins to become a universal symbol of human capability and determination. But what made Rosie the Riveter the iconic symbol of World War II victory? The answer lies in how the image and the women it represents embodied several crucial truths about America's wartime experience. First, Rosie represented the total mobilization of American society. Victory in World War II required not just military might, but the complete transformation of the American economy and society. The willingness of millions of women to step into unfamiliar roles, learn new skills, and work in difficult conditions demonstrated the depth of American commitment to winning the war. Rosie symbolized the home front's contribution to victory, a contribution as vital as anything that happened on the battlefield. Second, Rosie represented capability triumphing over prejudice. The women who became riveters, welders, and machinists proved that gender roles were social constructs, not biological inevitabilities. They demonstrated that given training and opportunity, women could master any skill and perform any job. This was revolutionary knowledge that, once proven, could never be entirely suppressed. Third, Rosie represented American pragmatism and flexibility. Unlike Nazi Germany or Imperial Japan, which let ideology prevent them from fully mobilizing their female populations, America proved willing to adapt to necessity. This flexibility, this willingness to break with tradition when survival demanded it, was itself a source of strength that contributed to Allied victory. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, Rosie represented ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Naomi Parker went from waitress to machinist. Rose Monroe went from widowed mother to bomber builder. May Cryer went from waitressing to building flying fortresses. None of these women were superheroes or exceptional individuals. They were ordinary Americans who rose to meet extraordinary challenges. That's what makes their story, and the symbol that represents it, so enduringly powerful. The icon of Rosie the Riveter reminds us that history is made not just by generals and presidents, but by millions of ordinary people whose names are never recorded, but whose collective efforts determine outcomes. It reminds us that human capability is far greater than social conventions often allow us to discover. It reminds us that crises can be catalysts for progress, breaking down barriers that seemed immovable in ordinary times. Rosie the Riveter became iconic because she represented all of this: sacrifice and strength, transformation and capability, the power of collective effort, and the indomitable American spirit. The poster that hung for 2 weeks in a Pennsylvania factory in 1943 became immortal because it captured something essential about a moment when America discovered strengths it didn't know it possessed. More than 80 years after Jay, Howard Miller created his poster, and more than 40 years after it was rediscovered and adopted as a feminist icon, Rosie the Riveter continues to inspire. She reminds each generation that we can do it, whatever it might be. She stands as proof that barriers can be broken, that capability matters more than convention, and that ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges are capable of remarkable achievements. That's what made Rosie the Riveter the iconic symbol of World War II victory. Not just the poster, not just the propaganda, but the real women whose courage, determination, and competence proved that America's greatest resource was the untapped potential of half its population. Their legacy endures not just in museums and history books, but in every woman who believes she can do anything, and every society that recognizes that human capability knows no gender. Rosie the Riveter became iconic because she represented a truth that, once proven, could never be unlearned. When given the opportunity, women can indeed do it.